sophomore or whatever. So we're very excited about that. And after any faculty or adjunct or guests that we have here today, if they'd like to join us for the reception over in the Student Center, I have the little tickets here so we can walk in there gratis. So just see me after the lecture and I'll give you one of the little papers to go over there. We can eat dinner and celebrate some more with Serena. But first I'm going to introduce our wonderful dean. So Donna Moran is our dean, and I'd like to introduce her, and she can introduce Serena. So here's
Thank you. Oof, thank you. If I didn't have to read this, I'd just go out there, but I really do have to read it. I want to thank Lisa, in any case, Lemieux, because she's been such a great supporter of the school in general and the Institute also, I guess, in general. At least from well before the time I came here, and it's been really a wonderful thing, including just some other things that she has done for us that is really helpful. And then you can always find her at Institute happenings, so that's great. This is a complicated day here, and we don't have as many students as we would normally have because it's also the opening of sophomore exhibits on Cottage Street. After that, after this lecture, I will be going over there to see the student exhibitions and then going to the dining center after that. So there's a lot going on. I was asked to introduce Serena not only because I'm the dean, but also because I'm a printmaker. So we share a common language in many ways. I'm going to read from Serena's, about Serena's work. It's, because some of the things I won't remember if I try to do it without reading. Perrone's work has been exhibited widely, including exhibitions at the Contemporary Art Museum, St. Louis, the Cleveland Museum of Art, the Philadelphia Museum of Art, and the International Print Center in New York. Her work is included in numerous permanent collections, including the Whitney Museum of American Art, the New York Public Library, Yale University Art Gallery, and the Cleveland Museum of Art, the Detroit Institute of the Arts, and Philadelphia Museum of Art. She was nominated for a Pew Fellowship in 2017 and has received fellowships and grants from the Paula Krasner Foundation, the Santo Foundation, the William J. Cooper Foundation, the Scuola Internazionale di Grafica, Venice, trying there, and the Vermont Studio Center. Serena is a graduate of the Rhode Island School of Design with an MFA in printmaking and a BFA in painting and a BA in art history and French from Southern Illinois University, Carbondale. She is currently the assistant professor of printmaking and drawing at Pratt Munson William Proctor Arts Institute in New York here, and is the co-creator and director of Officina Stamperia del Notaio, an artist residency and printmaking studio in Sicily. It's my great pleasure to introduce Serena and to look at her work and have her talk to us about her process. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Donna. And I want to express a really warm thank you to Elizabeth Lemieux, who I'm so pleased to meet for the first time today, Dan Buckingham, also Mitch, and everybody else that has come together to coordinate and make this lecture possible. I'm sorry for that noise. And also I apologize for the scheduling. It's the end of the year and there's so many things going on at the same time. So I really do appreciate all of you that are here today. And I will try to keep it in 45 minutes. So we'll go from here. Donna, thank you for your introduction. That pretty much sums up, where I sort of started and where I came from. I'll just say a couple words. I was raised in St. Louis, but my dad was an immigrant from Sicily, and my mom wasn't from St. Louis at all. She's American, but growing up in a place and not really feeling like you're from there is something that is not at all exclusive to my experience. It's something that so many people experience all over the world. But I think that having that sort of sense of, looking for things that have meaning, and finding yourself in places that are both foreign and familiar at the same time, is something that inspires a lot of people, and it definitely has colored the way that I look at the world and also the way that I make work. So I'm just going to say, I'm also going to read a couple things just for the sake of time, because otherwise I could ramble a little bit too easily. So my work is often situated itself in the space between the known and the unknown, between places, and from the precarious perspective of one who is neither completely on the inside nor on the outside. The natural world and the built environment are conflated, and reality and fantasy blur together. I feel like my work can be understood in relation to the categories of reference, terrain, evocation, and resistance. I usually employ various printmaking techniques, but I also include drawing, some sculpture, photography, and writing to reflect on personal mythologies, recount stories of destruction, regeneration, transition, enchantment, disenchantment, and I really hope to capture images of synchronicity and the uncanny. I also like to try to reveal the impact of the poetics of space on a person's psyche, on our character, and the politics of an individual or a populace. I also wonder how our mentality and perspectives on the world are formed by the spaces we inhabit, landscape, city planning, architecture, and the way they are all inextricable from nostalgia. I want my images to not only depict but enact gestures of reaction and resistance against certain kinds of constraints that we find in culture in an effort to establish and protect my own private or personal utopia. So as you're going to see, the images that I concern myself with have a strong relationship with storytelling, literature, narrative, and they're often playing on theatrical or pre-cinematic conventions, framing devices, and whatnot that relate to narrative. I regard everything from the written word to the landscape as a palimpsest. Through various methods, I attempt to understand my transit through both physical and psychological terrain, confronting contradictions and evoking magic and the essence of a place. And so one thing that I'm actually more interested in of late is how to recognize and sort of elucidate problems of nostalgia and fantasy and engage in both escapism and quiet but deliberate resistance. And so I think that one thing central to not only an immigrant experience, like first generation experience, but also just the cyclic sort of nature of time, I find that nostalgia is sort of a really important driving force in the behavior of a lot of people. And in some ways, it can be seen as sort of harmless and beautiful and poignant and romantic. And in other ways, it can be really terrible and sort of closed and sort of ignoring what reality actually is in favor of something that doesn't really exist or shouldn't exist. And so I think that as I'm reading and sort of learning more about what it means when we talk about nostalgia, there are a lot of things that dovetail with that, like the resurgence or, the origins of fascism and the resurgence of fascism in today's world. I think that nostalgia, for better or for worse, has some sort of role to play in that, as well as nationalism. And so I think, I'm trying to find the beauty in the world, but also be conscious of these really permeable boundaries between, things that can be really lovely and things that can also be extremely detrimental to culture and society. So I'm going to start by showing a little bit of some of my sort of source imagery, I guess you could say, and not that these directly show up in my work, but synchronicity, shape, and meaning are things that I observe and I look for and sort of stumble upon. I'm very, very attuned to when I'm walking through the world. And so I'm going to just show a few images that relate to this idea. Also, I just wanted to point out that although most of my work is printmaking based, photo becomes an important part of my life as a reference tool, as a sketching activity. I tend to take photos much more than I am likely to sketch in a notebook or something like that. And I also love to archive my photos and look back at them and figure out ways to connect ideas. It sort of shows me what I'm looking at intuitively, even if I'm not aware of it at the moment. I also look for finding parallels and patterns between places. And so I'm gonna I put that album cover up there. I mean, it's the Police Synchronicity album, but I found it in a flea market in Sicily. And then immediately afterwards, was walking around, found these tiles with sort of the same kind of primary colors, and the grate of like the milk crate holding the albums, and then like the fence over the tiles casting shadows. Like even something as seemingly unrelated as that can actually become something that has meaning for me in a certain moment in time. I'm going to cycle through a bunch of these images, try not to say too much about them and just let you enjoy them, but I do travel a lot. That is a central part to my work and sort of my method of like seeking out information, seeking out knowledge and experience. And so in Iceland, I saw these enormous basalt columns. They're called columnar joints, and they basically happen when lava cools too quickly or at a very rapid rate, maybe when it comes into contact with moisture or water. And so these also exist in Sicily, but here in Iceland, I mean, they're enormous, and I love that, if I could take a bird's eye view of those columnar joints, they would look like the paving tiles on the right-hand image. They're six-sided, perfect forms. And so playing with scale and sort of perspective are things that I like to do in my photography. I also am sort of like drawn to like little stones and sticks and things like that I pick up as I walk around. And so when I see repeating shapes that seem to hold some sort of like a portent of something for the future, I sort of latch onto them and I'll keep them or use them in my work. So here I find a little twig. It's like a forked stick. It could almost look like a slingshot or a divining rod, something that you would use to find a source of water or some other type of energy. I'm also really interested in how landscape and architecture kind of come together. In Venice, it's at a really heightened degree. And so the image on the left is the entrance to the cemetery in Venice, which is its own sort of autonomous little island off of the, not connected to the city. And the paving tiles that they use, the marble, sort of echoes the effect of the waves kind of lapping up onto the pavement. And then the right image is by the architect Carlo Scarpa, who is really iconic, particularly in Venice. But the ivy and the crescents, like all of these things were just really beautiful to me when I saw them. And so they do factor even these shapes into the work that you'll see. I'm also very interested in duality and dichotomy and sort of the repetition of shape and texture and meaning. So, a very spiky-looking, soft flower in an Etruscan tomb in Tarquinia, and a sea urchin in a child's bucket on the beach a few weeks later. They seem the same, but they're so different, and they can hold such different meaning. Similarly, when I was in Iceland driving around in 2013 with a bunch of artists, we came upon this whale skeleton that was out in a field, and it reminded me so much of a trip that I'd taken to see Etruscan tombs in Tarquinia in Italy. And the way that sort of these tombs, they've built these sort of spine-like roofs that sort of cover the entrance, and you sort of descend down. There's a door on the other side, and you kind of climb down into these little tiny chambers that are full of frescoes and just interesting spaces. But they're both death. So we have a tomb on one side, and then we have sort of the carcass of a whale on the other. But the way that they drape across the land and the landscape really struck me in that moment. Again, I have sort of like a ventilation tube in a wall in Sicily that's looking out at the landscape. And then the church that my family, in my family's town in Sicily, has this incredible spectacle that happens every August. And they literally have these theatrical scrims that come down and a pulley system behind. They do lighting effects, and this has been going on since the 1500s. So this is a really strong tradition. And the way that there's a framing device and the glowing lights and the silhouettes, I didn't really realize it until I was in graduate school that sort of looking through and sort of these gauzy, dreamlike layers were something that was really actually permeating my subconscious. And I didn't really notice it until about 2005, when I'd already been making work that was similar in a certain way to what you see here, but very different. And it finally started to make sense where this was coming from. I also love the contrast of something very beautiful but very brutal at the same time. So that sort of point of tension between hard and soft, brutal, soft, caring, poignant, romantic, all of those things I encounter really a lot in my life, but also in Sicily, particularly because of the landscape, the history, and just the culture there. It's on the forefront more. It's on the surface, and you see it in everyday life. And also the places of intimacy. So this is on one side we have the hallway in a staircase of a house that I spend a lot of time in there. And then on the right, we actually have the stairwell in the Vatican museums in Rome. And just the similarity of things, there's not such a difference between everyday life and just sort of the banal, quotidian stuff, and then things that seem very sacred or special. And so everything sort of takes on this patina of being very special in a certain way. So again, like expansive vistas and then really small kind of holes that you can kind of like peek into and see another world. These are all things that keep showing up in my work, and so I feel like I have to start paying attention to it and actually speaking about it. And again, more examples of repetitive shapes. And also the way that the landscape takes on its own sort of sense of architecture. So these are shots from a park in Venice, and I love the way that the image on the left, it seems almost like a perfect archway that's giving us a view of a cruise ship going by, and then laying in the grass looking straight up, there's like a perfect triangle above my head. They don't really mean anything. Like, these things don't really mean anything to anybody. And the only reason why they mean something is because I look for meaning in it. And so that idea of like determining what's important and what's not, these are things that as artists, we have to grow into and we have to grow away from. So I think that everything that I do is very cyclic, and certain things come back, certain themes and motifs show up again and again. Other things I have to sort of let go to rest and sort of move on to something else. So past work, again, a lot of my work is very narrative, and I'm thinking about pre-cinematic motifs. And by pre-cinematic, I mean things before the moving image. So before film reels, there were things like magic lanterns or flip books or, sort of like theater puppet shows and things like that, shadow puppets, and scrims and pulley systems like the one in the church in my family's town in Sicily. This is a view of the List Gallery at Swarthmore College in Philadelphia, and I did a really large series of woodblock prints that you see on the wall there on the right-hand side. All in all, there are about 7 in that series, and they're all done with lithographic metallic gold ink on frosted mylar, and then in the negative space, I've drawn with silver point and gold point. And so they're very large. They're 4 feet by 6 feet and hand-printed with a bone folder or a spoon. And so they take forever. And then when I'm editioning them, I have to actually redraw the silver point and gold point drawing from scratch every single time. And so this series, even though I started in 2005, is still not finished being editioned. So, every once in a while I have to like pull another one until I've met my fixed number of 10, I think. But every time I go back and revisit these, it's sort of a drag to have to pull out something that I'm done with. It's behind me, but every time I have to pull one out and look at it again, I realize that there's some aspect of it that's still relevant to my life today, and also just sort of retracing those lines and redrawing something from the past. It's a very slow process, so it gives me time to really like think about what it means and how the meaning has changed. So I don't really like to talk about precise meanings or sort of direct what a viewer finds in the work, because those meanings to me also change. So I hesitate to sort of put too fine a point on anything in that way, because I don't want anything to be a one-liner, and I don't want it to have like a finite ending. I feel like these are sort of living, breathing things that can change and evolve over time, just the way that I do and just the way that the world does. This is a piece that came after that. It's woodblock on Japanese okawara paper with gold pen and ink and some silver point, and it's actually a modular print. So if you took out the center panel, it would form a perfect circle, and the boat would be smaller and intact, and the figure would just sort of be hanging the clothes out to dry or like steering the sail. And then when you insert the third panel, the center panel, everything kind of goes awry. A figure ends up in the water, and the boat has broken apart. And now you're seeing it from a distance. In a way, it's like you're looking through binoculars. And so I wanted to sort of play with that idea of shifting perspective. This is a print that I think Cindy showed when she was here, Cindy Ettinger, the master printer that came for the Pribble lecture a few weeks ago. And this is the oratory in my town in Sicily, and it's a building that has just always held a lot of fascination for me, so it shows up in my work a lot. But again, this is called In Our Cinematic Lives, and so I'm depicting a figure that's projecting a beam of light against a shadow puppet that these conjoined twins are holding up. And then the shadow, instead of being black and white, the shadow itself is in color. And this is a two-plate etching with a digital sheen collé element in there, and that's from, I think, 2008. So again, sort of thinking about the surreal, dreamlike states, and sort of the idea of like artifice and facade, and how like the world is a stage in some ways. That stage-like quality also became more visually noted in my work around that time. And so I decided to literally make prosceniums. And so this is a series that is woodblock on frosted mylar yet again with silver point and gold point. They're much smaller. But later, many years later, I'm in Venice and I find, a little diorama in one of the museums there that really reminded me of sort of the effect that I was looking for, this sort of dreamlike effect. And again, this is a series of 7. I'm only showing you 3 right now. Each one has their own separate titles, but they all sort of come together. They're never shown individually. They're always shown in a series of 7. And the thing that's really great about these is that, again, I'm editioning them, and every once in a while, until the edition is finite and closed and finished, I have to drag them out every once in a while, print the next set, and redraw all of the silver point and gold point from scratch. But over time, the silver actually will tarnish, so that sort of dreamy image will actually get darker over time. So unlike a memory that maybe fades over time, these maybe get darker and more solid over time. And one thing to note is that all of the places that are depicted in these images are actually real places, and these are places that I go and they really exist. So I tend to take a real place and sort of dislocate it and put it into sort of a fantastic or more imagined space, or alter something about the landscape around it. These are dry points with marker. I didn't have access to silkscreen at the time. I made these at the Vermont Studio Center. So I said, well, I'll just draw with marker the cartouche areas. And so then again, I had to keep editioning. So my editioning process is definitely the variable edition, and there's a lot of hand-drawn information in each one. This is a series, or this is a print that is actually a Japanese woodblock print with etching and shinkolei. So this is about seven colors of the Japanese method, and then I made an etching to go along with it, and I actually had to cut them and shinkolei them together in the printing process. And these are all different houses that I've lived in in the past, and they're kind of floating around in this sort of volcanic, sulfuric pool. So going into that, one thing that's been really, really important to me in terms of imagery has been historically the image of a volcano. And so Sicily, for those of you that aren't too familiar, has the largest active volcano in Europe, Mount Etna, and it's an incredible, it's about 3,300 meters the last time I was on it, but it changes because obviously it grows and shrinks with the new bursts of land that come out of it. But Sicily is very, very old, and with this active volcano, it's really iconic, and it really influences, I think, a lot of the culture and the mentality and just the history of the place. The landscape, for sure, is very, very volcanic, and so you see evidence of that everywhere you go around the island. And so I like the image of the volcano because it also it underpins, certain people's personalities, and so a lot of my work is about interpersonal relationships or experiences that I've had in my past, and so the image of the volcano also stands in for sort of the feelings that people sort of bottle down and then let out, and then bottle down and let out over time. This cycle of destruction and rebirth and regrowth is something that is really amazing and wonderful. And in a volcanic landscape, it's in real time, and you're seeing it happen like right before your eyes. Whereas if you're in, let's say, Missouri, where I grew up, it's very flat. All of that stuff happened many, many, many years ago, and so you don't really see that active sort of cyclic thing happening. And the energy isn't the same as when you're actually in a landscape like that. Sorry, this is a large dry point. It's 3 panels, but altogether it's 3 feet by 6 feet. And it was all done by hand with engraving, dry point, and a Dremel tool, wiped a la poupe. And I'm giving this information because a lot of my printmaking students are out there in the audience, so I figure you'd like to know that information. And then the striping is done with gouache, hand coloring. So again, every time I edition it, I have to repaint all of the stripes. These are a few of the details. So a lot of my work also sort of depicts sort of ideal scenes that are sort of going through some sort of destruction, or there's some sort of peril, there's some sort of danger inherent to something that seems like a beautiful paradise. And I apologize for the blurry image quality of some of these. Again, we have a projector up there at the top, sort of shining these sort of fish scale tiles down. We have disembodied hands that sort of reference, let's say, like Fra Angelico or other painters from Renaissance Italy. And then just sort of contemporary scenes, like an empty toll booth or an empty phone booth and streetlights. In 2010, I'd become aware of this poet named Craig Arnold, and I'll just have to say a few words about this, but he was hiking on a volcano in Japan, and this was in 2009. The work that I made about him actually took place in 2010, but I was actually working in a gift shop at a museum in Philadelphia, and we had the radio on one day. I heard a story on NPR about Craig Arnold, this poet that had just disappeared on a volcano in Japan, and he had been there to hike around and sort of get inspiration for his next sort of body of work. And I was sort of captivated by that story because it was happening in real time, and he was missing, and like nobody knew what had happened to him. He was traveling alone. He didn't speak Japanese. But yet he was also there because of the volcano, and I thought, oh my God, there's another artist out there right now who's really drawn to these volcanoes, enough so that he's willing to go hike on them and put himself at risk to do that. And so I really followed the story in real time for several days, and I kept looking online to find out did they find him, what happened, and after maybe about 10 days, I saw the story that they had found his footprints and he had fallen into the volcano and they never were able to recover him. And so we don't know if it was a suicide or if it was an accidental death, if he had gotten overcome by fumes. We don't know what was going on. But I was just so kind of heartbroken about this because I felt somehow strangely invested in this story. And so I did some more research and I found that he had been keeping a blog, a travel blog, for each of the days of his excursion. And so he would go out hiking and then at night he would come back to his little hotel room and write. And they were just thoughts, they were fragments. And so reading them, I found that he was sort of expressing a lot of the same sentiments that I had been sort of feeling at that time in my life about just the tension between, approaching something from very close or feeling this urge to go far away from the familiar in order to see it better or to see it from a different perspective. And I think that was a motivating force behind his sort of urge to travel and do all of these things. And so I read all of his fragmentary blog posts, and I ended up making a body of work called Volcano Pilgrim in Exchange for Fire. So his blog was called The Volcano Pilgrim, and the exchange for fire was basically he sort of exchanged his life for this, this fascination with the fire of the volcano. And so I took fragments from his blog, and I actually silkscreened them into the plumes of different volcanoes. And I did more research about him and found that he had traveled to many different countries, from Nicaragua, Guatemala, even Stromboli, Japan, to visit and hike on different volcanoes over the course of many years. And so I sort of decided to make a timeline and panorama of his sort of trajectory and his path, starting with the first volcano that he visited and ending with the last one where he ultimately died. So these are dry point on plexiglass with gouache monotype, silkscreen text, and then handset lead type letterpress for the blog post, the actual time signature of the day and the time that it was posted. And then there's a letterpress colophon. And so I'm sort of reimagining his trajectory and connecting all of these unconnected places like Nicaragua and Japan by forming a panorama that's unbroken. So visually, each one leads fluidly into the next one, and they become one long landscape. So I'll just cycle through these really quickly. A couple years later, I had the opportunity to have a solo show at the Contemporary Art Museum in St. Louis. They even let me paint the walls this carnation, soft pink color with clear story windows above. It was a beautiful space. But I had been thinking about his work and sort of what it meant to me. And so I wanted to revisit those same volcanoes and actually make the work more about my own experience. So all of the houses here get the same treatment. They're sort of put into a fantastical landscape, but they're all real places that become one long panorama that sort of show my own trajectory through different locations that hold important meaning for me in my life. Superimposed on top of the volcanoes from the previous series. And this is called Maintaining a Safe Distance and Living to Tell. So the idea is by maintaining a safe distance from the things that are too hard to deal with or too intense to look at directly, you can live to tell about it. You can sort of dissect it and analyze it a little bit, and then you can reapproach with a new perspective. So these are photolithographs on top of silkscreen. And this is the process of printing them. I don't know why I must have pressed something, but the sidebar is showing up. I'm not sure if we can get rid of that. This is printing in Second State Press in Philadelphia. One thing that's super important to my trajectory personally has been working in community-based shops. Nobody really can afford to have their own presses very often, and so I helped some friends start a print shop in Philadelphia called Second State Press, and that started in 2010, and I've been sort of like a diehard member ever since, even remotely. Now that I'm here, I'm still a member, and through that, that sense of community that I felt there, I really have tried to sort of seek out everywhere I go. And the people that I've met there have become lifelong friends and colleagues and collaborators. And so in that space, a lot of magic kind of happens. Here you can see those two pieces together from the first image from the first piece and the first image from the second panorama, and the way that they sort of reflect one another. Going back to the whole idea of synchronicity, also the weird thing that seems to happen is that when I make an image of something, sometimes I'll stumble across something that seems uncannily the same in real life, maybe months or years later. Okay, so travel, duality, translation, and transmutation. In this little segment, I just want to talk about the importance of all of these things in my work, and show some images about how these things sort of come into play. So traveling in Iceland, I love that, in the morning you go to the coffee shop and on the paper, front page, there's the Aurora Borealis last night, wasn't it great? Or did you guys see that rainbow yesterday? This is pretty incredible that these things make the front page news there. And so you just kind of feel like you're getting coated in fairy dust, and maybe Icelanders don't totally feel that way, obviously. I think that also this idea of longing and nostalgia and wanderlust can be beautiful but also dangerous in the sense that we see things through this rose-colored lens. It's easy to overlook the blemishes and the really problematic things that are inherent to a culture or a populace. So it's easy to sort of feel like you're in this fantasy land when you're just passing through. And then the more time you spend there, you unearth the real nitty-gritty of a place. So those are things that I wanted to sort of confront in my own relationship to Sicily by traveling to Iceland, which was a place that I found to be very, very similar in some ways. So in the museum in Reykjavik, I come across this book called The Strange Familiar, and on the cover, it looks so much like this landscape that I know in Sicily. And so at that point, I was starting to make connections. I was thinking, well, they're both volcanic islands. They're both populated by, horses and sheep, and there are fishermen everywhere, and it's an ever-changing place with rich sort of mythology and ancient sort of essential knowledge, it seems like. And so the more that I drove around in cars around Iceland and just took snapshots out the window, the more it was sort of paralleling snapshots that I'd taken out of a car window over and over again in Sicily. So I started to pay more attention to this at that time. Even the beach on the northern coast of Iceland on the left, it was an unseasonably warm day. For a moment, if I closed my eyes, I felt like I was back in Sicily, which was a very strange, uncanny feeling. At that same time, I found a book by a poet, an Icelandic poet, named Jonas Bjarnason, and it was called Side Roads, and it was in Icelandic and English, so I was able to read it. And the things that he was sort of saying and ruminating about in his book were just so spot on to what I was thinking at that moment in time, literally reading it on that beach, feeling that I was in another place at the time. And so a few months later, I took the same book to that beach in Sicily. You can see I've sort of scribbled notes in the pages, and it sort of accompanied me. I started translating from the English translation of the Icelandic, I started translating it into Italian. So I translated the entire book of poetry into Italian with the purpose of pairing it with these images of Sicily and Iceland paired together. And I made a series of maybe 18 prints. These are cyanotypes that are postage stamp size. They're very, very small. And so the idea here is that I wanted to really get to the essence of the shape of the land and just the way that they could be confused for one another. So this is tentatively called Side Roads and Stereoscope, and the translations of the poems will follow. It's still a work in progress. I started it in 2013, but some things take longer than others. So I'll just show a couple of these. These are cyanotypes, but I allowed them to stay wet for a long time under plastic overnight or for a day or two so that they would yellow and kind of fade. Because I didn't want them to scream like, I'm a cyanotype. Not that there's anything wrong with that, because I love cyanotype, but I just needed something a little bit removed from that. Here is a grouping of some cyanotypes that definitely scream cyanotype, and I love them. These are from Venice, and the blue, these are actually backward, but the blue that you're able to achieve with that process is just unlike any other. And so again, looking at some of those same forms that we looked at before, and just sort of translating things from like one medium to another. This is working on a piece that resulted from these trips back and forth between Sicily and Iceland in 2013, working in Cindy Ettinger's studio in Philadelphia on a piece called Due North. And so here we're sort of translating or sort of like transposing, projecting the image of Sicily over an image of Iceland and vice versa, and just sort of weaving these two landscapes together. And this is a 2-plate etching with hand coloring and gouache. Around that same time, I had been reading a lot of poetry, Craig Arnold and like Wallace Stevens and Jonas, and I decided to really start picking up writing again. So this is a piece called On Love at First Sight, or Seeing and Not Seeing the Northern Lights, in parentheses as the subtitle, because when I was in Iceland, all I wanted to do was see the Northern Lights, and we didn't see them. I think I saw it for just like a split second, and it was almost like, did I really see that? I'm not sure. And that's sort of how like maybe love at first sight could feel sometimes. You're like, did I really feel that, or am I imagining it? So this is a suite of aquatint etchings that are scraped and burnished. And as I scrape and burnish through the various states, then sort of this indication of like the tail of the aurora borealis starts to show up. Again, some etchings from that time paired with things that I see in real life that echo. And then, so Fragments Revisited, going back to poetry, my grandmother on my mother's side, my American grandmother, apparently published a couple of books of poetry in the 40s and in the 60s. And one of her books was called Fragments. And I decided in 2014 I was going to Venice for an artist residency, and I was going to be there for 3 months. So I had this project in mind where I was going to be writing poetry and then creating small shaped etchings, shaped plates to go along with it. So this is printed in cyanotype. I don't know if you guys can read it, but I don't want to go over time too much, so I just will sort of let you guys visit the website if you want to read more about the impetus behind it. But I also took my grandmother's handwriting and put that into the colophon. This is working on the plates, sawing them out in the courtyard in Venice, doing scraped and burnished aquatint on them and a little bit of mezzotint. And just really like sort of reflecting the colors and the light of Venice, and just sort of these sort of like prism shapes or jewel-like shapes that resulted. They became, a series of prints there are about 27 poems in all, and it took about 2.5 years to really finish the entire edition. And yeah. So.
Do you hold on to those little plates and stuff?
They're in my closet in room 140 in the printmaking studio. Yeah, they're here. Because I'm not done printing the edition. I still have like 2 more sets that I have to print of this. So this is what it looks like when it's all spanky new finished, with a handmade portfolio box that's foil stamped, and they're all like perfect. But it takes a really, really long time. I can't tell you how many failed attempts went into this to even get the cyanotype to work. Place, epic, and artifact. So I feel like the work that I make is sort of like an artifact of the experiences that I have. This is a series called Albury Site Specific. I made these when I was teaching for the University of Georgia's study abroad program in Cortona in 2014. So I had just come off the Fragments project in Venice, and I went immediately to Cortona with no break in between. And I was just completely worn out. And I was having sort of like artist block, and I just wanted to like have an aperitivo and relax a little bit. But I needed to make work, and so I made these tiny little plates that are 3 inches by 5 inches. And I really just wanted to get back to basics and just test my hand at drawing and relying on line etch and just simple line, no aqua tint, no mixed processes, no digital, like no tricks, you know, just simple, essential stuff. And so I accumulated, 12 plates that are all this size that were made from different trees that just sort of captivated my attention throughout the semester that I was living there. And what I did was, when I got back, I wanted to sort of retrace my steps. And so I went on Google Earth, and I literally, like some of the time I didn't even know where I was when I encountered that particular tree. But I had to sort of go back in my memory and like literally retrace my steps on Google Map to find out the coordinates of where I had stood when I first saw that tree. And I actually found all of the trees on Google Maps. It was so emotional. Like, it was such a strange thing, because I was sitting in my office in Kutztown University in Amish country in Pennsylvania, and like literally retracing where I'd been just a few months before. And so getting those coordinates, I decided to do a letterpress colophon. And so instead of titling each image with the place name, I wanted to use the actual coordinate. And so in that way, when I'm, hopefully older and, still able to walk when I'm like 90 or my grandmother's age, maybe I can go back and use this as like a guide. I can go to the exact coordinate and revisit that same tree with luck. If I'm still around, if the tree is still around, if we're all still around, it would be wonderful. So then in Sicily again, going back to this idea of like the brutal and the beautiful at the same time, all of it sort of converges at once, and in a single day, you can feel on top of the world, or like just like you're being smothered. And so these are just a few images of my place. Things that I collect along the way, porcupine quills and things. And so a tile made here in the CAE program. So one of the best things about my first 2 years here in Utica was discovering the CAE program and the ceramics class that Veronica taught, the sculptural class. It was just such a wonderful introduction to Pratt and Munson and Utica. So I took Veronica's class and had such a ball and made a lot of friends. And made some work, which you'll see in a minute. The other thing that I've been doing a lot is alternative photography. So in Sicily, we have no shortage of sun. And so that's something that I've been doing over there. Rita and I were toying around with it yesterday a little bit, and I'd like to do more of that here as well. This is a piece that I made about 2 summers ago using all gum bichromate processes and installed in site in Sicily. So these are pieces that, they're actually photographs that I took while wandering around the space, around the landscape there, and moving in and out of, sort of the public view, I guess. One thing about Sicily, it's sort of like a very old culture. And so sort of like our sort of current norms of a female out walking by herself is not quite what you hope it would be. And I'm just going to read a really quick sort of statement about it. It's a place that's rife with contradictions, and perhaps the contradiction that's most intensely felt is the one that is hardest to identify. The sense of being encircled, enclosed, restricted, and smothered is countered by the sense of being expanded, exalted, enchanted, and set free. This duality is present in the physical landscape, where tight corridors and secret passageways give way to expansive views of mountains and sea. It also extends to one's intimate territory of identity and sense of being. The interior and exterior are constantly abutting one another. In both cases, whether physical or emotional, the passage between spaces involves a significant and sometimes painful transition. And so that's, a little blurb about sort of how this piece came to be. A few of them here. And then going back to my most recent work, this is called Fata Morgana Mondo Nuovo, and it was made with the fantastic help of Veronica and the generosity of Brian and all of the students in the CAE program. Special shout out to Diane, who I don't think is here, but she was definitely, like my buddy, and helped me a lot. And so in that process, I was able to sort of make these porcelain facades that are the same facade from that etching in Our Cinematic Lives. Mark Anthony Polizzi made me a beautiful sort of box for it, and Matt Saunders was responsible for table and also another floor piece for me. So the idea of collaborating and sort of getting other artists involved has been really, really fruitful and beautiful for me. That's the way that I've always worked, and I really enjoy it. So here we see the facade and the interior also of like the church. And that, again, that peephole kind of view and those silhouettes where you're sort of looking through one scrim and another and another. I'm also really influenced by, again, the pre-cinematic convention, and I'm just going to read a quick blurb about this one too. Fata Morgana Mondo Nuovo is a peep show that presents an ambivalent narrative mythologizing the small Sicilian hilltop town of my family's origin, employing many pre-cinematic themes and conventions to reveal a complex setting that is at once enchanting, idyllic, and abysmal. True to any place, the more time spent looking, the more the curtain is drawn back to reveal hidden narratives. Referencing mythology surrounding Mount Etna and themes of Sicilian puppet theater, Fata Morgana, like a mirage or a castle in the sky, is a place of fantasy rooted in mythology that holds the promise of harmony, appearing and reappearing suddenly and without warning, just like the Aeolian Islands that vanish in the changing light. Mondo Nuovo, or the New World, recalls Tiepolo's fascination with these microcosmic scenes and enchanting spectacle of watching while being watched. In this case, Mondo Nuovo reveals the place as through a darkened lens, the constant menace of the hidden all-seeing eye, subplots in the periphery, falseness, a culture of excess and depravity, paranoia, complacency, and self-destruction obscured by the beautiful chaos of the natural surroundings. When immersed in this real place, the outside world seems to disappear, and these contradictory realities flip and change as quickly as a glowing slide of a magic lantern, leaving me at once transfixed and burned like a moth to a flame. So this is a double-sided peep show. So inside, I don't have very many good images, but if you look from one end, you see more of like an idyllic landscape with something menacing at the very end. And then when you go to the other side, you see sort of like a menacing landscape with something idyllic at the very end. And so it's double-sided and ambivalent, just like every experience in everyday life. This is Diane and I extracting one of the many casts from the mold. And then a view of the interior, and then a little detail shot. And again, on the inside, all of these places are real. So even like the animals, the little dog and the little cat that show up in the donkey, like they're all, like the donkey is Katerina, like I know her, she's 20 years old, and the dog is Gigi. So like they're real things that are set into this like fantastic landscape, but I'm not that creative. Like these places are actually pretty true to life, as well as the rampant fires in Sicily that happen with more and more frequency. So these are some of the interior scenes that are mirrored. So inside the box, they're actually adhered back to back, and that allows you to have this like back and forth view. And then this is a solo show that I had last summer at the Print Center in Philadelphia. And so you see, all of these different works that I touched on are here together in conversation. And now I'm sort of doing a new edition of these just in silk screen with gold and cyan ink on top. This print is going to be donated for the student art fundraiser, the art material fundraiser. So if you want one, keep an eye out. This is a little etching I did. Again, this sense of sort of destruction and cyclic things. On this site, there used to be a Roman villa, and there's like no trace of it left, but there is a little camper. So every time I walk past it, I like want to go in there and snoop around, but I'm worried about getting shot, so I don't. And just sort of playing around with also, a lot of things in Sicily that there's a whole other chapter that I didn't touch on, but it's sort of the evil eye and talismans and superstition and stuff like that. So that's sort of what these past few images have been about, just sort of thinking about those things. And so the gesture on the right, these are little like sculpey paper clay things that I've been toying around with in my dining room. But the hand on the right is actually, it's like an offensive gesture, but it's also meant to ward off the evil eye, one of the many sort of hand gestures that Sicilians know very, very well. So inside and outside the classroom, I'm just going to spend a couple minutes on this really quickly. I like to sort of do projects to sort of follow my own, the own assignments that I give to my own students. I kind of try to set up for myself as well, and I don't succeed in doing it every single semester, but this was a demo print that I did for a reductive class that I still show today when I'm teaching that method. But one thing that I want to instill in you guys is to really never stop learning and always keep seeking out new experiences, new materials, new ways of making work, new ways to sort of collaborate with other people or listen to what other artists are contributing. And so this is a time that I got to work at the Fabric Workshop and Museum. I did a period there where I was there for about 4 months, and I got to learn how to print silkscreen textile. So, repeat patterns, gigantic screens that are taller than I am. Also, like the collaborative print shop experience, doing residencies, traveling, and being an apprentice to other artists. I've done internships and apprenticeships with countless print shops and well-known artists, and I've learned so much through these experiences, and even taking the programming that Audrey offers with the CAE classes. Like these are amazing resources that you need to keep seeking out when you get out of school, especially those of you that are doing things that are dependent on equipment or certain techniques that you feel like you can only do when you have the right facility. You have to expand, you have to figure out ways to keep your momentum going, to keep working, even when you don't have a print shop. So that's why those gigantic woodcuts happened, because I didn't have a press, I didn't have access to a studio, I didn't have a wood shop, I didn't have a print community or anything at that point, so I just resorted to hand printing gigantic wooden blocks. It kind of hurt my wrists by doing it too intensely, but these are things that it's part of the art practice. So as an artist, as a designer, as a, whatever discipline you go into, it's never too old to do an apprenticeship or to learn to learn a new skill. And it's actually essential to your sort of success as an artist. So we're very lucky that we have this partnership between Pratt and Munson Williams Proctor, and that there are so many opportunities for people to continue to enrich their experience and their realize sort of like their personal visions. These are, again, like demos that I like to do, the Japanese woodblock printmaking method. When I was teaching at Kutztown, I invited the East Asian history class over. So their professor brought over all their students. They had never touched anything print-related in their life, and so they all learned how to make a Japanese Edo period sort of style, Japanese woodblock print, and they all got to take one home. And so I really enjoy thinking outside of the box and contextualizing what happens in the classroom with what is going on outside of the classroom. These are students that I took to Venice for a winter session course, and we did book arts and alternative photography and printmaking. We got to visit artist studios and come back and have a show about the work. I'm taking students here to Second State Press, Space 1026 in Philadelphia, which is sort of like an underground sort of art space, the Fabric Workshop, and Cindy Ettinger's studio down at the bottom left corner. So, really getting out, pick my brain for things that you want to know about. If you're home bases in Chicago, let me know, and I can put you in touch with people that are looking for people to come help them out, or ways that you can get involved in the print community there or the larger art community in general. So that's one thing that we all have in common. Like we have this like network of artists that we all disperse and we come together and then we disperse again. So we can help direct the next generation to the people that can help them the most in their career. And then lastly, in the summers, I sort of get out of town immediately because I go to Sicily to run an artist residency program called the Officina Stamperia del Notaio. And it's not only printmaking, we have poets and writers, sculptors, painters, photographers, filmmakers, all of the above. We're sort of like a catch-all, but we do have a printing press there. These are some of my former students and one of my colleagues from Temple Rome down at the bottom in our first season that we had. It was a lot of fun. We're in our like third or fourth year now. And so again, it's like just a way for artists and international artists to sort of come together and share space and work and sort of learn from one another. And I also try to make opportunities for students to come and help me there. So like a work exchange type of thing is something that I've done in the past. So I believe that, older artists that have the means to sort of pay their own way could help sort of finance the experience of a young student or like an emerging artist that comes there. So I try to sort of find a balance and make that happen for people so that we have all ages and all sort of ranges of experience. And also sort of pairing with other schools that do things like sustainable farming and natural materials. Last Christmas, I was in Siena. I got invited by Stonehill College to go do a workshop that combined sort of like printmaking and alternative photography using sort of natural raw pigments. And we also were combining that with sustainable farming and agriculture and sort of learning how pigments are made, learning how paper is made, and learning what plants dyes are made out of and things like that, and then visiting a vineyard or a place where they're raising sheep for the wool and for the cheese. And so having that sort of like holistic experience is something that I really love to do. And then here we are in room 140 and in the museum. So we have McCall up there. He was fantastic, and he just became enamored of Joseph Albers' wood block prints. So Mary pulled some out for us to see, and he was just like over the moon last year. And so also, like my work is very, concerned with the graphic arts, but also illustration and narrative. It's not just sort of like one category. So I really try to make sure that people understand how printmaking can cross over into illustration, sculpture, typography, graphic design, product design, glass, ceramics, all of those things. So even if I'm not doing all of those things in my own practice, I want to sort of make it clear to students that there are infinite paths using printmaking techniques as a jumping off point. And I think that we're very lucky here that we're able to sort of touch on a lot of that at one place in one time. So that does it for me. Thank you so much for being here. And I really want all of us to run across the street to Cottage really like immediately so that we can catch the incredible show that is definitely already in progress over there. But thank you so much for your attention. You can always grab me in 140, but if you want to find me online, you can follow me at those things. And I hope this was a good window into my thought process and sort of how my work changes and evolves over time. So any questions, we can take them now, or also at the dining hall or at Cottage, or you can come next week and visit me in the print shop. I don't want to hold people longer than they need to, but if there are any quick questions or statements that people wanted to make, I'll take any of those now.
Thank you very much.
All right.
Big comment.
All right. I think that was a whirlwind, and that probably does it for me. So why don't we adjourn and run over to Cottage and go see the great work that our students are making. So.